not come to Europe. Do not believe the smugglers. Do not risk your lives and your money. It is all for nothing. Those cold words were uttered by Donald Tusk, President of the European Council, as the refugee crisis grips and divides Europe. In panic mode, European nations are brushing off their human rights and claimed moral authority by building fences on their borders and engaging in or finding themselves complicit in xenophobic rhetoric and violence within their borders. But why aren't more asking how much of this crisis was Europe's own fault through its own foreign policies, and if this will now change from encouraging war to bringing in long-lasting peace? That and more in this debate.
Frustration boils over into anger at Macedonia-Greece border, where an influx of refugees fleeing multifaceted crisis in the Middle East and North Africa are left behind closed doors. More than 25,000 asylum seekers have been left stranded in Greece by the tightened border controls to the north, raising fears of a humanitarian disaster. Macedonia, along with several other European countries, including Balkan states, has taken unilateral actions and shut its borders amid the EU's failure to come up with a serious solution.
I feel miserable. I am absolutely depressed to face this hard situation in such a place in Europe. We ran from this to find another kind of this. This is in brief. Here, the situation here is we are dying, but slowly.
Desperate President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, on a visit to Greece, warned illegal migrants against coming to Europe. Tusk said, quote, "Do not come to Europe." Officials said Tusk is seeking to eliminate entirely the transit of refugees from Turkey to Greece.
I want to appeal to all potential illegal economic migrants, wherever you are from. Do not come to Europe. Do not believe the smugglers. Do not risk your lives and your money. It is all for nothing. Unilateral decisions without prior coordination, however understandable they are in a national context, are in fact detrimental to the European spirit of solidarity.
The deepening EU refugee crisis has pitted the members of the fractured alliance against each other. Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras, who days ago recalled his ambassador to Brussels, said Athens could not bear the burden by itself. Greece demanded equal burden sharing among all EU countries.
People are worrying more about finances, they're worrying more about their borders and not really putting what should be first, which is humanity. The West came into many countries across the Middle East. There were no walls to keep them out. They didn't ask if they could come in. We didn't build walls to stop people coming in. And so why are there walls now to stop people who are escaping situations that, let's face it, the West has been central to creating? There should be no walls. There should be millions of refugees that should be allowed into the West, and they should be welcomed. And they should be treated in the same way as the Europeans treated other Europeans during the Second World War.
The refugee crisis has fermented a toxic tide of neo-nationalism, which threatens to tear the European Union apart. The bloc faces the fallout of the West's warmongering policies in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, with the nationalist movements ascending across Europe, calls have grown for a quick and comprehensive solution for the refugee crisis.
Let me now introduce our guests for this debate. We're joined by author and journalist, Mr. Gearóid Ó Colmáin, who is joining us live from Paris. And we're also joined by writer and lecturer, Mr. Jonathan Fryer, who is joining us live from London. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us for this debate. Mr. Fryer, I'll start with you. The EU wants Turkey to reduce migrant arrivals to under 1,000 a day, with the Dutch Prime Minister even wanting a number closer to 0, according to him, as a condition for taking some of these Syrian refugees directly from Turkey. Now, the goal seemingly is to eliminate the transit of migrants from Turkey to Greece. Do you think this upcoming EU-Turkey summit, will be successful in such a regard?
It depends really what alternative is available, because clearly Europe is feeling the strain from literally millions of people who've been coming into the continent, many of them indeed using unofficial routes from Turkey into Greece, where on the other hand Turkey has housed over 2 million refugees themselves. So clearly there does need to be a coordinated strategy in which Turkey is involved, which can involve, as for example, the British have been giving aid to camps so refugees who are in camps in Turkey and Lebanon and other countries. But the real problem is that unless the situation in the Middle East calms down, refugees are still going to keep coming, and that's really the only solution, is to make sure there is a lasting peace, particularly in Syria and to a certain extent in Iraq as well.
Indeed, Mr. Colmáin, I put the same question to you essentially. This lack of coordinated strategy we're seeing in Europe, do you think that will be resolved soon?
Well, it has been known for some time that there is a lack of coordinated strategy in terms of immigration policy in Europe. But I think the real issue here is the cause of the wars which have pushed people out of their countries and forced them to go into other countries where most of those people whereas most of those people would prefer to stay where they are. NATO is the cause of the war in Syria. NATO is the cause of most of the wars that we see right across the world. Now, if we are going to talk about stopping the wars, then we need to be very serious about identifying the perpetrators of war, the warmongers in London, in Paris, and in Washington and Tel Aviv. These are the powers who planned the war in Syria that was confirmed recently by the former French foreign minister. It is an absolute disgrace that people are still blaming this problem on the Syrian government when they have been fighting a war for survival against Western-backed terrorists since 2011, in the very same way the Libyan government fought a battle against Western-backed terrorists in 2011. And the liberals and conservatives and other people in Europe who supported those wars are also complicit in war crimes and crimes against humanity. And that needs to be addressed. So that is one issue. Another issue, of course, is that a lot of the migrants coming into Europe are being used as weapons by the Turkish government. And this is a policy referred to as coercive engineered migration. They are using the migrants as weapons with which to put pressure on the EU in order to speed up accession into the EU, which is part of US policy in Europe. And US geopolitics in Europe is currently in conflict with a lot of European elite thinking in terms of their future. The reason why they are now backtracking on the open door policy and the open border policy is because they're beginning to realize what is happening. They are beginning to realize that the United States is essentially trying to transfer the wars that they created in the Middle East onto Europe. And of course, the Balkans is a particularly volatile region. Macedonia has a very big problem with ethnic Albanian minorities. That's been stoked up by the United States. They already attempted to overthrow the government in Macedonia. There are big oil issues here to do with oil supply and gas supply from Russia. South Stream and Nord Stream are two major projects the United States are trying to sabotage. So the geopolitics around this is something that needs to be discussed as well, because the United States is essentially trying to...
Okay.
Just been cut off, I think. I don't know if
no, we can still hear you, Mr. Colmáin. Anyway, let me just put some of the points that you made there, Mr. Colmáin, to Mr. Fryer. Mr. Fryer, as Mr. Colmáin there just said, there are a lot of geopolitical issues here surrounding this migrant and asylum seeker crisis that Europe is facing at this point. But I'm wondering if Europe knows that it is because of the foreign policies that are played out in the Middle East that this issue exists, then why can't they all unite? Because what we're seeing is more and more division instead of more and more unity.
Well, there are two very distinct questions there. Let's take them each in turn. I don't share the analysis of your other guests this evening. I think it's simplistic to blame everything on Western foreign policy. Undoubtedly, the government of Syria must shoulder a lot of the blame for what has been going on over the last 4 years. I was in Syria when everything started in 2011, and there were peaceful demonstrations, and the government cracked down on them very hard instead of trying to negotiate, and things really snowballed from there. But on the second point, there really is a problem of European governments not coming to an agreement on some sort of coordinated plan. And that's partly because some countries, like Germany, feel that they have the room and the ability to absorb quite a lot of people. Others, like Britain, where we have a growing population and really services that couldn't cope with very many more, are in a rather different situation. But it is absolutely vital that the European Union does manage to get a coordinated response, and in particular to help Greece, because it's just for geographical reasons that poor Greece has ended up really getting the brunt of this flood of refugees coming in.
Okay, so Mr. Colmáin, Mr. Fryer there disagrees with you on the fact that it is foreign policies of the Western governments that have created this entire crisis. How would you respond to that?
How could it not be the foreign policy of Western governments that have created this crisis, for God's sake? Has he not even read the newspapers? They tell you themselves, once you actually read the newspapers, you can read that in Le Monde. It's been more or less admitted by everybody. Let's just get serious about this. Are we going to continue to destroy this? How many people have died in Syria? We're already talking about 450,000 people who have been murdered in that country. They were planning this in Britain in 2009. It was confirmed by the French Foreign Minister himself. There are many documents and declassified documents which confirm this. If we don't get serious in our analysis of Syria, and we still talk, we start using, platitudinous sound bites to try and cover up the fact that the West is responsible for these wars, not only will the people of Syria be eliminated and other countries, but they will use all of the other people to spread the war right into Europe, and it will be on everybody's doorstep, because there are ISIS militants in Europe. That has been confirmed by NATO commander himself recently. And we know who's responsible for ISIS. The United States is responsible for ISIS. We know the United States is backing them. We've seen footage of US helicopters accompanying them in Syria. We have documents to prove that they've been supplying them since they were created in Iraq in 2006 in a US prison. So to say that the West is not responsible for this crisis is just absolutely ludicrous. The West is absolutely responsible for this, and people need to understand the origin of these wars, because if they don't, the wars will not only kill all of the people in those countries, but it will kill everybody else. The war will spread to Europe, and American elites would like to see that happening, because they know that Germany's geopolitical future, as a Central European power, its geopolitical future is with Russia. And they also know that a huge percentage of the German national bourgeoisie are very much against Merkel's policy of sanctions against Russia. They want to sell cars. They want to move factories. They've already got factories in Russia and in China. They want to open up factories in Iran. They want Eurasian integration. And the United States is now going to use migrants, who are themselves the victims, the ultimate victims of globalization, as weapons against European countries. That does not to say that the people coming in here are not refugees. There are many, many, many refugees, genuine refugees in Europe. But the debate has not been correctly framed. What one needs to understand is that US foreign policy in Europe at the current period is about destabilizing Western countries and creating chaos. It is likely, and it's very likely, that the European Union will fall. That's the reason why they are now backing. A lot of European officials are backtracking on the migration crisis and trying to close borders because they want to stop it. But I think it's probably too late. And so it is quite possible that if the European Union falls, then you will have a period of chaos. There are arms stashes all over Europe. They've been there since the Second World War, since the NATO Operation Gladio, which they used to discredit left-wing ideology during the Cold War. There were stashes all over Germany, all over France. They're still there.
Mr. Colmáin, if you allow me, I do apologize for interrupting you. I just wanted to put some of your points, if you allow me, to Mr. Fryer as well, to get a response from him. Mr. Fryer, I'm wondering, Mr. Colmáin there said something important, that it's important to frame this discussion in the proper manner so that Europe is able to deal with, as you as well admitted, the root causes of this entire refugee crisis that we're currently seeing. How important do you think it is for Europe to have such an honest discussion about what has gone wrong in its own policies and then deal with that?
Well, certainly in Britain there's been a great deal of discussion, particularly about the Iraq war, because I think there is no doubt, and it's certainly the view of the majority of the British population, that George Bush and Tony Blair's war in Iraq was not only disastrous for the Iraqi people at the time, but has had huge knock-on effects. That I absolutely accept. But the situation in Syria is quite distinct. And I would like to take opposition to, or a different point of view to your other guest on the idea of some great American conspiracy to lead to the downfall of the European Union. I just don't think that's true. We often hear conspiracy theories from a particular left-wing point of view, but that's absolutely not the situation as it's seen by most people here. And I think, frankly, most Germans would be absolutely astounded to learn, as your other guest put it, that they would rather join with Russia than be part of a more united European Union. That is certainly not the point of view of most Germans that I speak to.
Mr. Colmáin, would you like to respond?
Well, it is the point of view of most Germans I speak to, and I speak German and I read German, and I can tell you for a fact that many people in Germany would prefer to see peace with Russia. They would prefer to see an end to NATO's wars. They would prefer to see some kind of social policy that enables German people to have families, that enables German people to have some kind of a future. They would like to see some kind of logic in the government's policy. These people don't get a voice in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. They don't get a voice on German TV, but they are very numerous in Germany and in Germany's independent media. So to say that Germans do not want peace with Russia is not representative of the German people. As a country I know very well, having lived there, Germans want peace. They experienced war in the past. They don't want war again. Many people in the German political elite, former officials in the OCE, and people, former editors of major German newspapers have spoken out about this. Udo Ulfkotte, former editor of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, wrote a book about this. A lot of people in Germany do believe that the United States is conspiring against Eurasian integration. The United States have openly admitted they're doing so. Why do you think they are sponsoring colour revolutions in Eastern Europe? Why do you think they are militarizing Eastern Europe from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, trying to create an intermarium? Why do you think that they've been propping up Turkey for all these years? It's to destroy Russia. They've made no secret about that. You can read it in the works of Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former national security advisor of Jimmy Carter and a major advisor of Barack Obama as well. So to say that there is no US policy of destabilizing Europe is not factually true. We have evidence of many NGOs in Europe who are receiving money from US agencies. For example, cite a few examples. PENG, the PENG NGO in Berlin, they have been involved in smuggling refugees or migrants into Europe. They're linked to the Ayn Rand Corporation, or the Ayn Rand Institute rather. The Ayn Rand Institute is an extremely right-wing institute which is run by an Israeli American. You have Watch the Med. Watch the Med is another NGO which has been involved in smuggling people across the Mediterranean, and they've been deeply involved in destabilizing Eritrea. Eritrea is a progressive country, a country that has been ploughing ahead, has been making a massive progress on social issues, and for that reason has had sanctions imposed on them by the United States. And they are, and I have this on official sources, the United States are trying to siphon off the youth of that country. They are trying to corrupt them in the embassy in Asmara. They actually provide internet services for youth. They try to coax them in, and then they try to turn them against the government. This is standard US policy. You can read it in official documents. It isn't being discussed in this crisis because of the false framing of the debate in terms of pro and anti-refugee. Certainly in Europe, we're seeing the rise of the far right. We're seeing a lot of reactionary Europeans marching against migration. They don't seem to understand, of course, that one country, probably the only country in the world that has created more refugees than any other country in modern history, which is Israel, They don't realise that that country is very much for open borders in Europe and very much for getting as many people out of the Middle East as possible. And there's a very good reason for that. It's because they're expanding in the Middle East and they don't want strong states to exist. They've said that themselves. You can listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu admitting that they would like to see Syria balkanized. They would prefer to see ISIS in Syria rather than the Syrian government.
Okay,
so
if you allow me to come in here, Mr. Colmáin,
a lot of
I just wanted
Israeli
to put,
NGOs actually smuggling people into
some
Europe
of those
as
points,
well.
because we just have about 4 minutes left. Mr. Fryer, I'm wondering, regardless of where you lie on, where the policies of Europe have gone wrong, certainly Europe's policies have gone wrong, and that both of you have admitted. So I'm wondering, all of this has a very humanitarian, a very human face to it, because there are 10,000 human beings standing at the Macedonia-Greece border right now, not being allowed in to Macedonia to be able to then get further into Europe to seek asylum or to seek refuge in places where they are comfortable or where governments can take them. Borders are going up, fences are going up, etc. How do you feel about Europe's reaction as a whole?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's essential that the European Union has a coordinated response, and that will, of course, include having a workable policy with those European countries like Macedonia, which are not part of the European Union. I think it's important that viewers understand that fence is between Greece, which is in the European Union, and Macedonia, which is not. But there certainly needs to be a coordinated response by the European Union, and I think it's a matter of great regret that a number of governments, not all of them by any means, but a number of the member states' governments, places like Hungary, for example, have been extremely hostile to any sort of really proper European humanitarian response. But the real problem, of course, is also the more people who are let in, there is a pull factor, even more will then want to come. And so we've got to solve the root problem back in the Middle East so people don't have something to fear and something to flee from.
Mr. Colmáin, we have about a minute and a half, so I'll give you the final word. Go ahead.
Well, I think, first of all, we need to stop the wars. We need to frame the debate properly in understanding the complexities of US foreign policy and the complex geopolitics around the refugee crisis if we're to actually solve this. I don't think we have enough people doing that. We need to stop the war in Syria. People need to understand who the terrorists are in Syria. They need to understand that the West are behind al-Qaeda, that they created al-Qaeda for the purpose of destroying nation states, and in particular for the purposes of class war. Remember, al-Qaeda was created in Afghanistan to destroy a democratic revolution there, and that's its purpose. It's to go in and destroy any kind of democratic mandate that people in the developing world have, and to be used also as a tool against domestic populations to make them support these foreign wars. These foreign wars have got to stop, and the destabilization, the use, the instrumentalization of the victims of these wars needs to stop as well. There are two sides of the same coin, and they need to be identified. If they're not identified, this crisis will get much, much worse in the coming weeks and months.
Okay, we'll leave it there at that, but of course we do appreciate both of your contributions to this edition of the debate. That was author and journalist Mr. Gearóid Ó Colmáin, who had been speaking to us live from Paris, and we were also joined by writer and lecturer Mr. Jonathan Fryer, who had been speaking to us live from London. And of course, viewers, we do appreciate you joining us as well. Until next time, good night.